Hi, this is Vijaya Atluru for Abiding Grace podcast. Today we will see in Genesis 25th chapter up to verse 19. Abraham got married again and to a concubine, it says, and brought children, and he dies. And then Isaac's story kind of goes silent without a lot of chapters of his story. It's a smooth sail from Abraham, Isaac, and then to Jacob and Esau. The reason Isaac's lifespan doesn't occupy many chapters is because in the Old Testament, the writings were more dependent on theophanies, that is, manifestations of God, and his covenants to the people and the promises. When the covenants were more often, or renewal of the covenant, and the divine manifestations were more often, the story was written in many chapters, like Jacob's story or Abraham's story. But in Isaac's life, not that many divine manifestations of recording were not available. It does not downplay Isaac's life or Isaac's importance, because Isaac had a life in the link between Abraham and Jacob as a covenant bearer. So he did his faithful life toward God as a covenant bearer. Sometimes for us it's a lesson, not because somebody's life is so glamorously up in the sky or in the limelight when people talk about. It does not mean that they were greater than the people who were not talked about. So it depends upon the role that God gives. So it is the faithfulness rather than how much it is displayed in life. The faithfulness to God counts in God's count. It might not be displayed on the human stage. So we have to be careful not to get disappointed or not to elevate other people whose life is in the limelight. It's the faithfulness, ultimately, it counts for God. Whatever role is given in each person's life, it's different for each person, because we are uniquely created for a different role. We are not created in batches, like in numbers, like products or medications or equipment. We are not created in batches. We are created uniquely, there's no other person like you or like me. We are the only one of our kind. Like in the human role, we have our role uniquely, with the uniqueness, gifting, and uniqueness in character, uniqueness in weaknesses and strengths also. But our duty is to walk faithfully with God. Having said that, let us jump to verse 19 in chapter 25. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If all is well, why am I like this?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two people shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." So when her days were fulfilled to her, to give birth, indeed, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. And afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man dwelling in his tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, and Rebekah loved Jacob. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, Sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, Look, I am about to die. So what is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, Swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils, and he ate and drank and arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Abraham and Sarah were barren 10 years after they came into Canaan, so Sarah devised a means to produce a son through her concubine Hagar, or her maid Hagar. And then later on, Isaac was born 25 years after they moved from Chaldean country to Canaan. Here Isaac was 20 years, Isaac and Rebekah. They didn't have children. That shows that how Isaac learned from his father how to wait on God. Actually, Isaac was very faithful to God and trusting God, and he waited patiently for 20 years. And instead of devising a plan how to get a son, he pleaded God. And so that shows Isaac's faithfulness and trust in God. And Rebekah conceived, and there were 2 nations. Here we see in verse 3, an oracle, prenatal oracle from God. 2 nations are in your womb. The 2 boys represent 2 nations rather than 2 individuals. The principle of representation is all over in the Bible. That's so important for us in Jesus Christ. In the Garden of Eden, Adam, the first Adam, who was made out of dust, represent all humanity, whoever is born on earth. And then Abraham represents all the believers who trust in God, not necessarily ethnic Israel, but all the people from all nations who trust in God. He represents the spiritual children, not necessarily his physical descendants. Actually, his representation of spiritual children is what the promise is God gave. Your children, your descendants will be numerous, like a countless, like a sand on the seashore and stars in the sky. So the principle of representation is like our, in today's terms, like a football team. It's the one unit, though there are several players in it. If one player plays bad, the whole team loses. If one player really excels, the whole team wins. So like that, it is a representation rather than individuals. We know the principle, we operate the principle, but we don't really apply it when it comes to understanding the Bible. Sometimes that is what happens. So in Jesus Christ, he represents, because he is called Adam in 1 Corinthians, second Adam or last Adam. That means he is the federal head of the spiritual humanity, all those who come to him or come to God through him. In saying last Adam, and in saying he is of the stock of Israel, or from Jesse's, from Adam, David's line through Mary's womb, the tribe of Judah, he represents the whole Israel. But whole Israel will not automatically belong to God in the New Testament unless they put faith in Jesus Christ. Because though he represents the whole humanity like an Adamic race, he only represents those who believe in him, that is the believers. So the principle of representation is so important to understand the Bible. Otherwise, we get stuck in 1 or 2 interim steps in the Bible story. The Bible story is one whole story from Genesis to Revelation. And one covenant, one God, and in the Old Testament, Israel and Gentiles. In the New Testament, it is superimposed by believers and unbelievers with the same meanings in them. I repeat these things because unless we keep track of these things, it's very easy to get sidetracked and get into the misunderstanding of God's plan and purpose. That doesn't do good to our soul, nor for us to be faithful to the Scripture. So 2 nations are in Rebekah's womb. It's 2 people, but 2 peoples. It says peoples groups, and one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So here, even before the children were born, God is already at work, because we saw Abraham had 2 children, 2 sons, one Ishmael through Hagar and one through Sarah. Through Sarah, Isaac was the promised seed to carry the covenant or the seed line, ultimately for the Messiah to be born. Ishmael stands outside the covenant, though Abraham is his father, a different mother. But in this chapter, the same mother and the same father, 2 children, one is chosen. Chosenness is not a blanket statement. Chosen for what? Chosen to carry the covenant seed line, that all other nations will be blessed through that seed, the promised seed, ultimately Jesus Christ. It is like in a class of 100, if there is 100 or 30, depending upon our understanding in a school class. If the teacher asks one student to go get the candy that is in her classroom, it is to say that all the students will be given the candy. Of course, there is a choice not to reject or to take. So it's not that one student who is called to bring the candy is the chosen one in a blanket way. It's not a blanket statement. Chosen to bring the candy to bless the class. That's what we miss sometimes when we say chosen, 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 as if others were not at all favorable to God. That's not what the Bible is saying. We have to keenly look into the Bible to understand what the Bible is saying, rather than through human mind, through our own mind, through our own understanding. That is where the Bible gets a little messed up. And God's image is kind of a shaky, like it's on the moving waters. It's not stable in our minds. We cannot get encouraged, nor we will be drawn to Him in the sense through understanding of who God is in the Bible. So that is very important. So chosen, one person is chosen already. One is stronger and would be a leader, and the other would be a servant. In Romans 9th chapter, if we see, in verse 10, not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one man, even by our father Isaac, but the children not yet being born, nor having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of Him who calls. It was said to her, the older shall serve the younger, and it's written, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. That's in Malachi. So it is the chosen line comes through Jacob, though Esau is the older. Here I have to stop a little bit, and we need to dig into what is meant by the firstborn. There are 2 types of firstborns. One is by birth, the firstborn. But the other also, there is other category in the Bible, sprinkled all over the Bible, is the one, though he's not the firstborn, gets the firstborn rights, the firstborn privileges. In the ancient society of that time, the firstborn was very important in other cultures, not only in the Jewish or the godly culture, even the other nations. Even in India, in some sects of community, the firstborn gets a lot of importance. He represents the father and he makes the decisions and things like. The firstborn in the Bible, whether it is because of the chosenness or because of the allotment by the physical father or chosen by God, or just by being by birth the firstborn, the privileges are the firstborn will get a double portion of the father's inheritance and also carries the privilege of representing the family as the priest of the family, if I can say that. And he represents also the father's responsibilities. He carries on the father's responsibilities. He becomes his father's representative over the rest of his siblings and the family, to be the elder, to be the decision maker. And in the Jewish community, the one who carries the seed of promise, that's ultimately Jesus Christ. I say that all the time in order to clarify. So in Deuteronomy 17th chapter, no, it's not 17, 21st chapter, 17th verse, it reads like God says as a rule, gives a principle, if the firstborn, even if the firstborn is born to the wife, or because they had many wives in those days, it was allowed because of the hardness of the human heart, not because God was winking it, multiple marriage. Even if the son was born, the first one was born through the unloved or unfavored person, because human mind always favored one wife over the other, that unloved person's wife's son should get the firstborn rights or the inheritance. Why did God give that? In order to protect the oppression of the unfavored wife and his children. So he put it in a law in such a way that there will not be injustice in the family, just because the man didn't love that wife to whom the firstborn was given. So it is in a different sense. And in Israelites, after God delivered Israelites from Egypt, Exodus 13th chapter, 13 and verse 13 and 15, he says, every firstborn should be dedicated to God. Why did God say that? That's with a different sense, because the firstborn represents the whole family. So if the firstborn is dedicated to God, that means the whole family is dedicated to God. In that sense, God gives that command to dedicate the firstborn to serve God. And later on in Leviticus, the firstborn, instead of serving God as a in the temple, he could be exchanged with the 5 shekel, depending upon the age and the gender. They could be exchanged, that the priest would serve, and they would give the money to the temple. Also in Exodus 23rd chapter, 19th verse, the first fruits need to be given to God. Again, the same principle. The first fruits represents the whole of that harvest. That means giving the first fruits is as if the person is saying, my whole harvest is yours, and I thank you for giving me this harvest, and I give this first fruits to you. In the Old Testament, that was celebrated as a festival also, to keep God as the first priority or the authority and the sovereign Lord of the family or the nation. Israel is also called the firstborn. In Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn son. Here, it's not by birth, it is by election of God. Election is by grace, because if you see in Deuteronomy 7th chapter, 7th verse, Moses was saying to Israelites, the Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all the people. So Israel was considered as the firstborn son by God, by the gracious election of sovereign God. It's not because they were anything higher or loftier than other nations or other people. So election in the Bible, choosing the covenant carrying or the seed line to bring the promised Messiah into the world, is by God's sovereign choice, not because of any specialty in that chosen person. It explicitly says, not because you were great or more in number, that God chose you. So chosenness is God's prerogative. It doesn't depend upon the one's character or one's greatness. So we should not elevate anyone who's chosen, but the covenant line, in this context, Israel. It's not to say to hate or to, it's not hatred, it's not even elevation, because God is the one who chose for his purposes. He's sovereign, like a potter who chooses to make the pots of different sizes. The small pot doesn't mean despised. Bigger pot doesn't mean the bigger pot is great. God is great. So the chosenness does not give credit to the Israelites or to the person who's chosen, but gives responsibilities. Rights and responsibilities go together. Privileges and responsibilities and accountability go together. So privilege doesn't stand alone. The privilege is given to God chose Israelites to be a blessing to the Gentile nations, to represent God to other people, to be a light to those who are in darkness, to serve those who are not chosen so that they may show God. It's not to be boastful about it, not to be arrogant about it, not to despise other people. Do you see what they did? They missed what God intended them. Of course, God knew that they would miss, because God's focus was on his own son, who would represent God fully, both to Israel and to Gentiles later on. Israel were the stock of Adam's race. Of course, they would fail like we would fail. If we were chosen, we would have failed like them. So this is the chosenness is by God's sovereign election of grace, not by worth. And the firstborn, later on, the firstborn title is given to who you know, you guessed already, to Jesus Christ. Let us see in Colossians 5th chapter. We won't be able to cover the whole thing today. We have to take another class. In Colossians 1st chapter, 15th verse, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. He is not in the creation. He is not the firstborn in the creation. He is over the creation because he created and he is not part of creation. He is the creator. He is outside of the creation as the author of creation. So he is the firstborn. So he existed before the foundations of the world, and he was chosen by God the Father as the Lamb of God before the foundations of the world, before Adam ever sinned against God. So he was the firstborn over the creation. And in 1 Corinthians 15th chapter, in verse 20, but now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Here Christ is the first fruit because he is the first one who rose from the dead. Of course, Lazarus was raised from the dead, but he has to die again. But Christ rose from the dead, conquering the death. So he conquered the death as a victorious person over the death. He rose again, never to die again. So Christ risen from the dead and has become the first fruit who have fallen asleep. So Jesus Christ is the firstborn now. He is the real firstborn who is the fulfillment of the covenant of God given to Adam and Eve, to Noah, to Abraham, to Israelites, to Jacob, down the line. So all through the covenant line, the seed line carries the seed of the promise, that is the Messiah. So here in chapter 25, coming back to the Genesis, so God chooses one over the other, not because Jacob was great, Jacob was faulty. It does not depend upon his character or his personality, as it did not depend upon Israel's greatness, that God chose them to be the seed line or the covenant carriers till the seed comes, the promised seed comes. The same way, so God, why is he doing in choosing the younger over the other, in paradoxical to the tradition of that day? Because God is sovereign, and he shows it is not of the human tradition that brings the salvation to the world. God goes contrary to the ancient culture, and he chooses the younger. He topples the culture, he topples the human tradition, because salvation is not standing in the human way. It is God's way of grace and graciously giving. It does not depend upon human tradition. So thus he is showing, if you go to again to Romans chapter 9, verse 4 and also verse 6, we will see. Who are the Israelites? To whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises. Of course, Israelites were given a lot of privileges. The law was given, the covenants of the temple, the regulations, as a type or a foreshadow of the realities. But it's not an automatic salvation. It's the privileges were given with responsibilities, but yet they have to trust in the one God sends. When they do not trust, they are acting like Gentiles. But before the final consummation of the world, we cannot say who is a believer, who is not a believer yet, because some might believe in the future. So we are not to judge. And in verse 8, that is, those who are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as. See, though the promises were given to them, though the law was given, though the privileges were given, though they were elected by sovereign grace of God, not by their worth, as the covenant bearer or the seed line to bring the Messiah later on, they will not become the children of God automatically, because they're children of the flesh. They go under the regulations outside regulations of religion, they will not become the children of promise automatically because they belong to the stock of Israel by proper name. But the intent of Israel has to be brought in. That is, the children of promise are the only seed of the children of promise are counted as the seed, not counted as children of God, as in first chapter of John's Gospel, verse 12 and 13 also. Not the physical descendants of Abraham are the children of God, the spiritual descendants of Abraham. Whoever puts trust in Jesus from every nation, tribe and language are the children of God. That we know practically. If someone is born even to a pastor or a Christian household, they will not automatically become Christians. They have to personally choose to put trust in Jesus Christ and ask the Lord to be the Lord of their life and the Savior of their life. If we can apply that in present generation, how are we going to miss applying in the biblical concept? The children of, though somebody is born in the pastor's family, they are children of the flesh, but they will not become the children of promise till they put their own trust in Jesus Christ. It's the same thing with Israelites also. Though Israel was considered as the firstborn to carry the seed line with the rights and privileges, still they have to put trust in Jesus Christ. They will not become automatically the children of God. We are misunderstanding somewhere, at least some of us. So that is why here God's election of grace and sovereignty topples the human understanding of tradition and even ethnicity. Israel is not Israel, but who put trust in Jesus Christ are Israel, true Israel. So God is a really wonderful being. We try to understand in the Bible, His image becomes more and more attractive and beckoning our soul to bow before Him and to surrender, to commit to Him and to live for Him. As Paul puts it, that we are compelled by His love because He loved us to live for Him alone. So we will take up this topic of firstborn and Esau and Jacob, the ruthless traitor or the bargainer, in the next session, God willing. And because I don't want to take up much time in one session, because a lot of you might not even have time to listen. Isn't God wonderful?